Good afternoon and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche organization for Saturday, March 26th. The visual that we showed you a few minutes ago is a picture of Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman, and founder of the Executive Intelligence Review and of the National Caucus of Labor Committees and other organizations, in a discussion with Ronald Reagan, who was then not yet President of the United States. He was a candidate for that office. This is pictures taken in 1980 at a debate in New Hampshire. That discussion and subsequent discussions created the basis for something we're going to be discussing in some detail today. But we're here today because in 2 weeks, on April 9th, the Schiller Institute will be holding a conference to convoke a new security and development architecture. Now, the process of organizing for this conference, which is the next 2 weeks, is one in which what we're trying to do is to use a particular method, and we refer to it as the Treaty of Westphalia method. This refers to a period in 1648, which began a 5-year negotiation process to bring to an end the 30 Years' War of Europe, which had killed about a third of the population of Europe at that time. And the conception is that there is a principle, sometimes called the benefit of the other, in which there is no victory of one without a victory for all. And it is this method that we believe has to be the basis for the form of discussion and negotiation that has to go on between the United States, Russia, China, all other nations, given what has recently begun to emerge globally. Just yesterday, in fact, the London Telegraph featured a headline that indicated that perhaps the world was about to go mad. That headline, which you're seeing there, said, Joe Biden ready to use nuclear weapons first in, quote, extreme circumstances. And then you see subtitle, U.S. President abandons plans to water down policy to retaliation only amid fears Vladimir Putin might deploy nuclear arsenal. Now, what that refers to is that Joe Biden had stated, when he campaigned for presidency of the United States, that he believed that you had to have a policy that nuclear weapons are solely used in the event of a nuclear attack upon the United States. They are not a weapon of first use. That the United States would never use nuclear weapons first, which was the earlier stance that presidents have had. And once you start to toy with this notion of first use of nuclear weapons, what's sometimes called preemptive strike, then you have placed your adversary in an untenable position. This is not the first time in our history that such things have occurred. In fact, 39 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche and Ronald Reagan collaborated, that collaboration having begun this period earlier, to attempt to effect a policy called the Strategic Defense Initiative, ultimately, to deal with precisely the problem of this kind of nuclear chicken game that was holding the entire world hostage. On March 23rd, 1983, Ronald Reagan concluded a speech that he gave to the nation with the following passage.
If the Soviet Union will join with us in our effort to achieve major arms reduction, we will have succeeded in stabilizing the nuclear balance. Nevertheless, it will still be necessary to rely on the specter of retaliation, on mutual threat. And that's a sad commentary on the human condition. Wouldn't it be better to save lives than to avenge them? Are we not capable of demonstrating our peaceful intentions by applying all our abilities and our ingenuity to achieving a truly lasting stability? I think we are. Indeed, we must. After careful consultation with my advisors, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I believe there is a way. Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. Yet current technology has attained a level of sophistication where it's reasonable for us to begin this effort. It will take years, probably decades of effort on many fronts. There will be failures and setbacks, just as there will be successes and breakthroughs. And as we proceed, we must remain constant in preserving the nuclear deterrent and maintaining a solid capability for flexible response. But isn't it worth every investment necessary to free the world from the threat of nuclear war? We know it is. In the meantime, we will continue to pursue real reductions in nuclear arms, negotiating from a position of strength that can be ensured only by modernizing our strategic forces. At the same time, we must take steps to reduce the risk of a conventional military conflict escalating to nuclear war by improving our non-nuclear capabilities. America does possess now the technologies to attain very significant improvements in the effectiveness of our conventional non-nuclear forces. Proceeding boldly with these new technologies, we can significantly reduce any incentive that the Soviet Union may have to threaten attack against the United States or its allies. As we pursue our goal of defensive technologies, we recognize that our allies rely upon our strategic offensive power to deter attacks against them. Their vital interests and ours are inextricably linked. Their safety and ours are one, and no change in technology can or will alter that reality. We must and shall continue to honor our commitments. I clearly recognize that defensive systems have limitations and raise certain problems and ambiguities. If paired with offensive systems, they can be viewed as fostering an aggressive policy, and no one wants that. But with these considerations firmly in mind, I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Tonight, consistent with our obligations under the ABM Treaty and recognizing the need for closer consultation with our allies, I'm taking an important first step. I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles. This could pave the way for arms control measures to eliminate the weapons themselves. We seek neither military superiority nor political advantage. Our only purpose, one all people share, is to search for ways to reduce the danger of nuclear war.
We seek neither military superiority nor competitive advantage. Now that's something you haven't heard for quite a while, nor has it been the policy of the United States since particularly the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then the subsequent 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. After that, we and others, let me point out, British and American interests pursued a policy of superiority. And that's exactly the tragic mistake that has led us to where we are today. But what is, I think, more important to point out is that this policy that you just heard from Ronald Reagan was the brainchild of Lyndon LaRouche, a still not acknowledged fact in general. But it has been acknowledged in certain respects. What is important, however, to state before we talk a little bit about the cover-up of that fact and the fact that Americans to this degree today still don't know, is to now turn to the further content of that policy as Lyndon LaRouche described it in 1984 in a broadcast that was placed on network television during his presidential campaign of that year.
Essentially, strategy is not a military question. but a political and economic question. When politics and economics fail to avoid war, military means adequate to such a purpose must bring matters as quickly as possible to a peace defined in political and economic, not military terms. Thus, the strategic military policy of the United States toward the Soviet Union must be a military extension of a peace policy, must be an instrument for establishing those political and economic policy relations between the powers, which serve as the basis for durable peace.
The key to all 7 articles of the LaRouche Doctrine is contained in Article 1.
The political foundation for durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nation states, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress, to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers and those relatively subordinated nations often classed as developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. Insofar as the United States and Soviet Union acknowledge the progress of the productive powers of labor throughout the planet to be in the vital strategic interests of each and both, the two powers are bound to that degree and in that way by a common interest. This is the kernel of the political and economic policies of practice, indispensable to the fostering of durable peace between those two powers.
Now today, once again, an alternate security and development architecture is required and can be built. But it will only be done by replicating the international approach that economist Lyndon LaRouche took when he negotiated the policy of the Strategic Defense Initiative on behalf of the United States government and through the auspices of the National Security Council from 1981 to 1983. But the idea was that this was a policy from the outside and from the top down. It was an outflanking and a defeat, temporary defeat, of the British oligarchy's usual control of the thinking of leading governments, institutions, and people, including the United States government. In today's meeting, what we're going to do is to discuss how Lyndon LaRouche, through an idea and through his actions, was able, as a private citizen, to directly affect the presidency of the United States, and that relationship between the individual citizen and the executive branch of government is the primary relationship that must be reestablished today among all of our citizens and the institution of the presidency before we have a form of debacle that would have been otherwise completely unthinkable. Now, to get us started, to actually give us sort of both where we stand and the orientation of this sort of new Treaty of Westphalia approach that we're taking, we have Harley Schlanger, who is a spokesman for the LaRouche organization, and he's here to get us started. So, Harley.
Okay, Dennis, thank you very much, and hello to everyone. What we're witnessing in the West today is a moment when the concentrated power of an arrogant, nihilistic elite is committed to replacing truth with narratives and purging classical beauty from contemporary culture. Toward what end? Well, to establish a global order which protects the wealth and power of a few at the expense of the vast majority of mankind. Looking at this moment of current history as a historian, I see the triumph of an anti-human outlook we thought had been defeated at the end of World War II. Instead, we find this outlook dominating life and all features in the transatlantic world today. Now, this was powerfully addressed by Russian President Vladimir Putin on March 25th during a ceremony when he presented the Presidential Prize for Culture to young people. And I'm going to quote from Putin because we in the West very rarely have a chance to hear what he actually says, as opposed to the lies that are coming out of the talking heads of the media, and unfortunately by most officials in government, diplomatic, and intelligence positions. What Putin talked about is the importance of classical culture, in this case Russian classical culture. But he said the best classical works are focused on the inner life, personal quests, and emotional experiences of human beings. They ask relevant questions, help people to think, understand, and draw conclusions. He said that it's this quality that has protected the Russian people even today, when seemingly eternal concepts and norms are being eroded and undermined in different countries. History is being distorted, and the laws of nature itself are being violated. And then he went into a discussion of what we in the West now call cancel culture. And he said the attacks on Russian culture are in many ways part of they're using the military operations in Ukraine as an excuse to do it. But this has been there for a long time. He said, today they're trying to cancel an entire millennium-old country, our people. I'm referring to the mounting discrimination against everything related to Russia. The names of Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, Rachmaninoff are being removed from playbills. Russian writers and their books are being banned. And then he continued, the last time a campaign like this happened, it was the Nazis who began destroying objectionable literature in Germany nearly 90 years ago. We know well and remember from documentaries the burning of books on public squares. And he said, today we're seeing attacks on Western artists, on Russian artists in Western countries, carried out with complete connivance and sometimes with encouragement from the ruling elite. And we've seen this with the attack on the Russian conductor Gergiev, who refused to denounce Putin and therefore had his contract ended in several Western countries. The attacks on Anna Netrebko, the soprano, because she wouldn't denounce Putin. And we're even seeing such silliness as the identification of the children's cartoon Masha and the Bear, which is a particular favorite of my youngest daughter, attacked as Russian propaganda. Now, it's in these circumstances that it should not be surprising to see the kind of thrust coming from the Biden administration, and especially also from the British government, against Russia, to the extent that there's now an effort underway, as Dennis just mentioned, to change the nuclear order when it comes to military policy. The idea that the U.S. would consider now using nuclear weapons first under certain conditions reflects an ongoing discussion in this administration, which is based on an unreality, a delusion of American power, and the idea that somehow we have the right granted to us to defend the so-called rules-based order with whatever means are necessary, whether it's cultural warfare, economic warfare that starves populations and denies them medical care, or military attacks. Now, this came out the day before Biden left for Europe in a statement issued by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, in which he said that after there had been much talk about how Russia was responsible for threatening nuclear war over Ukraine, after Putin raised the awareness status of the Russian nuclear force. But why did he do that? He did it after Zelensky talked about Ukraine developing nuclear weapons and the constant discussion of the West having to be prepared to defeat Russia in Ukraine and to use anything necessary to do that. What Sullivan said is that nuclear weapons must be discussed because they represent a potential contingency. Now, this goes against the discussion that took place last June when Putin and Biden met, and they reconfirmed the statement from Gorbachev and Reagan that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Now, from the Western side, there's a discussion of the possibility that we may have to use nuclear weapons in this fight. Now, at the same time, what's the policy towards Russia coming from the meetings that took place of NATO, the European Union, the G7, Biden's trip to Poland, and so on? Well, at a point where the de-escalation is essential, where there must be further diplomacy to stop the continuing fighting, what's the U.S. policy? Well, calling for Russia to withdraw. Remember, the West had refused to negotiate seriously with Putin since 2007 at least, although it goes back earlier, after the U.S. and Western countries broke promises on NATO expansion eastward, canceled some of the nuclear agreements that were there, and then continued to defend the Ukrainian policy of assault on the Russian ethnic population in the Donbass, even though there had been an agreement called the Minsk Agreement that had to come under negotiation between Ukraine and the people of the Donbass. So Putin's effort to discuss security guarantees had been rebuffed, rejected, refused, up to the point that there was considered by the Russians no option but to carry out special military operations to do what? To demilitarize Ukraine, to keep Ukraine out of NATO, and to denazify the country. And the Western policy response at these meetings over the last couple of days was more arms for Ukraine, more funds, more logistical support, more intelligence support for Ukraine, more troops to be deployed into NATO, and more sanctions. And connected to the sanctions were the threats of war trials, war tribunals, based on what they are calling the human rights violations of the Russian armed forces. Now, this is where you get to the narrative that's being presented of a brutal Russian barbaric assault on the innocent, freedom-loving people of Ukraine. Now, this has nothing to do, as we've said repeatedly, with a Western commitment to sovereignty for Ukraine and freedom for the Ukrainian people. Remember, this was escalated with the 2014 regime change coup that was run by the United States as a color revolution that was designed to prevent Ukraine from serving as a neutral buffer state, which was, in a sense, what was the policy that was being pursued by the Yanukovych government. Instead, we were told the Russians were subverting Ukraine, bringing it into the Russian bloc, and that the Ukrainian people reacted to defend their sovereignty and their freedoms. Well, first, let's take up this question of the Russian brutality. Ironic, as the charge comes from those people who unleashed shock and awe against Iraq. As Colonel Douglas MacGregor pointed out, more people died in Iraq in the first hours of shock and awe, more civilians, than in the entire military operation so far, which is now more than a month in Ukraine. In the first hour, more died. The targeting of towns by the United States and NATO, the destruction and wiping out of civilian infrastructure. This was a war crime. Has anyone talked about that? Well, I'll tell you who talked about it. Julian Assange, who's rotting in a British prison where they're trying to kill him for publishing U.S. documents that portrayed the truth of the U.S. operations and the NATO operations in Iraq. And Iraq is just one of many. You could add Libya, you could add Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, and so on. Now, what's come out in the last days have been some courageous journalists and the military officials and others who are saying that this narrative about Russia is not true. They're not destroying the civilian population and infrastructure. If they wanted to, they could, but they are targeting the military capability and the in-depth capability in logistics necessary for the Ukrainian army to survive. This was in an article by war correspondent William Arkin in Newsweek. Colonel Douglas McGregor has been making this point repeatedly. Scott Ritter, in several interviews, has made the same point. So you compare what was done as a threat against Russia to how the Russians have conducted what they're doing, and there's no comparison. And when you talk about the attacks on Russia, you have to go back to the shock therapy policy at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was disbanded, when the Warsaw Pact came apart. It was done peacefully. And promises were made, those promises were broken. And instead, shock therapy was implemented. Sort of the predecessor of shock and awe in Iraq. Shock therapy was the destruction of the Russian economy, the physical economy, the dismantling of industry, the takeover of raw material and strategic metal reserves under the auspices of the City of London banks, Wall Street banks, in which this country was looted to the bone, put into a demographic crisis, which only now, more than 30 years later, is being reversed. Now, during this time, there were two documents I just want to call to your attention, which reflect the more serious, sober views. One reflects a more serious, sober view of an American official. The ambassador to Russia at the time, it was written in 2008, William Burns, who now is the CIA director, and maybe one of the few people who can speak the truth to Biden. Burns sent out a memo in 2008 titled, "Niet means niet," that is, no means no, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. And what he said in this memo is that NATO membership for Ukraine, quote, could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene, unquote. 2008, William Burns, now CIA director, wrote that memo about what he obviously saw would be a provocation to Russia. Now, more recently, we have a 2019 report from the RAND Corporation called Overextending and Unbalancing Russia. And the first measure they mention in order to do this is to provide lethal aid to Ukraine. The second one, increasing support to Syrian rebels. Point number 3, promote liberalization in Belarus. Number 4, expand ties in the South Caucasus. And point number 5 was reducing Russian influence in Central Asia. This is what we have said is the intent of the Western response to Russia, to break apart the growing potential for a Eurasian integration with China, which would naturally include a connection with Western Europe. That's not acceptable from the standpoint of the City of London and British geopolitics. That's been the target of British geopolitics since it was first identified as geopolitics by Halford Mackinder in his speech in 1904. No allowance of Western Europe and Eurasia as an economic alliance or integration. So this was out there before the military operation of Putin, but it was out there to shape the response to Putin's request for security guarantees. Now, that's why what we're looking at with this discussion of escalation, the Biden administration talking about being prepared for Russian use of biological and chemical weapons, when this was put out after the Russians exposed the fact that the U.S. Defense Department was involved in Ukraine in bioweapon labs and experimentation. Now, the escalation of economic warfare against Russia is another piece of this. The attempt to destroy a nation economically and to attack it culturally. As we've been pointing out, this has a very great possibility of a boomerang. First of all, Putin moved to protect the Russian economy by insisting that purchases of Russian oil and gas be made in rubles. Now, what this does is a number of things, but interestingly, it raises the whole question of whether or not the dollar system is finished. And this is somewhat implicit in the potential of a Russian-Chinese agreement, which includes many parts that were signed on February 4th. But also when you start attacking the dollar reserves held by countries, I mean, stealing $9 billion from Afghanistan, which was done by the U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve. Well, what about $300 billion stolen from Russia? And it raises the question, why would countries want to place their dollar reserves in U.S. banks if they're going to be stolen? And if you have a potential for other currencies besides the dollar, which at this point has nothing backing it up because of the destruction of the U.S. physical economy. What it has backing it up is a military capability and the tradition of American economic strength, which is being destroyed as we're speaking. Instead, the idea of possibly a market basket of currencies which are related to physical production. For example, physical goods like oil and gas, as the Russian ruble is now being the shift in Russia. The Saudis accepting the Chinese yuan for purchases of oil from there. The rupee for rubles trade between Russia and India, and so on. So we're seeing a policy imposed by the brilliant geniuses of the Western financial elite, which actually is hastening the destruction of the dollar system. Now, some people say that's what they want. Well, that's not what they want. They want a global financial dictatorship. They want a world in which no nations have the sovereign right to stand up and defend their populations. Our conference on April 9th is aimed at giving the world's population, including the Western population, which is otherwise controlled by censorship and lies in its media, giving them a chance to stand up and say, we demand the sovereign rights of our nation in cooperation and collaboration with other sovereign nation states. As LaRouche always emphasized, he made that as his first point, as you may have seen in this brief presentation we had from him, that the move toward a new defense security is predicated, number one, on economic security for all nations, all sovereign nations. And so our conference, which is being called to take up the establishment of a new security and financial architecture, is something in the interest of every single person on the planet. But it's especially urgent that people in the Western countries break the power of these financial elite who consider themselves elite, but their quality of thinking is zero. They've collapsed the world economy. They've put us on the edge of nuclear war. And so we're calling on our viewers and our supporters to join with us to create this new global architecture of security for every nation, that no nation is secure unless every nation has security guarantees. And that means, among other things, no to an empire, whether it's a petrodollar empire or an empire as defined by the efforts of Mark Carney and Fink of BlackRock and others to establish a global central bankers dictatorship. That means no to neoliberalism, no to the neoconservatives who want a unipolar world, no to Malthusian genocide. And that means we fight for a Westphalian principle for all mankind.
Thank you, Harley. We're going to be able to answer questions. We've already gotten a few questions in, and so we will be going to questions shortly. We want to hear now from Paul Gallagher. And I want to say something about Paul, because Paul seems to make it his business to be present at several points of changing history. 39 years ago, as the designated spokesperson of the Fusion Energy Foundation, he briefed the press in the immediate aftermath of the Ronald Reagan proposal. The foundation and Paul were the only available competent source on the nature of the presidential proposal at that time. Later, Paul was one of the persons that had the honor of being incarcerated together with Lyndon LaRouche, not for what he or LaRouche were charged with, but for the crime of speaking the truth about the potential of the Strategic Defense Initiative and the idea of implementing a policy that had not been authorized by the ruling oligarchy of London and Wall Street at the time. Paul's now the economics desk editor of the Executive Intelligence Review, and he's joining us today to elaborate both the economic and strategic implications of recommitting the United States exactly to that outlook through the presidency that Lynn had offered at that point, and that today the Schiller Institute is attempting to implement. So, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. I think that more than anything that I'm going to say today, it's crucial that people remember the words that you heard the voice of Lyndon LaRouche reading from that 1984 formal form that he published of what the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time should be, based on the revolution in what appeared to be a military doctrine, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which LaRouche had been responsible for. And he said, as you recall, that peace must be maintained by war must be avoided by political and economic means. Political and economic search for progress and the general welfare for mankind as a whole, for all countries. And that when it is inevitable that those means are not used and therefore peace breaks down and military means are used, war must be brought to an end by agreements on political and economic means, by those kind of agreements which seek the common benefit of all the nations involved and all the nations in the world, at least implicitly. That was what he embodied in the policy of beam weapons anti-missile defense, which he pursued for years prior to March of 1983. And he pursued it in particular in the period of the first years of the 1980s, a period in which there was a great fear of nuclear war because of the increasing deployment of shorter and shorter range nuclear equipped missiles whose flight times, either to cross the borders of the European countries or across the borders of the Soviet Union, were measured in a few minutes, and which were proliferating on both sides, the Soviet side and the side of the European countries, in particular Great Britain, but also involving France at that time. It was a period of great fear of nuclear war, and those who are aware of that at any moment in this crisis, a nuclear war could be launched for reasons that Harley went through. Those people are called on, all of you, to act so as to build an April 9th conference which cannot be ignored by the leaders of all these conflicted nations, despite the fact that the policy of that conference is on a higher level and a qualitatively different level than their current thinking. It's on the level of the Peace of Westphalia and on the level of the posing the development of the developing countries as the task for all of these advanced economies. Those may not be able to ignore this conference that the Schiller Institute is holding on the 9th. That is, everyone who understands this is called upon to make sure that that's true. Now, in the early 1980s, this fear of nuclear war, which was considerable and to the point where there were mass demonstrations occurring in many European cities in 1982 in particular, and those demonstrations were calling for a kind of simple military-only solution of stop the deployment of the short-range missiles on the European side. That was called the nuclear freeze movement. It got very large during that period of time. But that threat of nuclear war at that time was combined with there having been a full decade of raging inflation throughout the 1970s, more and more intense inflation, and there having been a deep recession beginning in 1980 and lasting really through 1982. It was in that situation of a growing threat of nuclear war, of the ravages of inflation on economic activity, and a deep recession, the deepest by far since the Great Depression at that time. It was in that context that President Ronald Reagan took office in the beginning of 1981. And he was a president, because of his own background, to whom all of those factors were important. Now, at the time that Ronald Reagan made the speech, which ended, as you saw earlier, with that extraordinary and historic evocation of effective anti-nuclear weapon defense, on the principle that weapons which could be defended against effectively would not be used. When he made that speech, those people who were working closely with Lyndon LaRouche in the previous years in organizing for what Reagan called for had a suspicion that that day he was going to conclude a scheduled speech with this kind of a historic call. We were very much on edge because there were clearly people in his administration who were opposed to the very idea, and therefore until he actually said the words, it was not clear that he was really going to do it. But at that time, there were two competing mobilizations for the United States to adopt an anti-ballistic missile defense system, or at least the intention to deploy one. One of them came from within the military-industrial complex. It had the name of High Frontier. It had it was based on the claim that existing missile technologies could be adapted rapidly in order to develop anti-missile missiles, which could in turn be deployed in space and or from space-based vehicles. And those anti-missile missiles could become so precise that they would strike ICBMs and other nuclear missiles which had been launched and strike them before they could release their warheads. This came from within the military-industrial complex. Then there was by that time, in March of '83, 6-year-long public campaign by Lyndon LaRouche, and increasingly involving his entire movement and its co-thinkers in other countries, to base a new anti-missile defense policy on what were called colloquially beam weapons. That is, what devices which were based on the laser and related beam revolution, which had been brought into being beginning in FDR's administration with the committee headed by Vannevar Bush, and had become, as Reagan said, the part of the fundamental basis of economic activity and economic progress in the United States. There's no question, there was at that time no question in anybody's mind who heard Reagan's speech which of the two conceptions he was talking about. The fact that he talked about years and perhaps decades of fundamental research in order to produce breakthroughs in ways that were not conceivable then to effectively defend against nuclear missile launches, that in itself made clear that he was talking about a scientific and technological revolution, not off-the-shelf military industrial technologies. The fact that he said that he was doing this after consulting with his advisors and in conformity with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972 would tell anybody who knew anything about this that he was talking about new physical principles entirely. That is, the physical principles of a relativistic beam revolution in defensive weapons, which would also be a revolution in the existing technologies that could be used in the economy. Because the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty said very clearly that the ban on attempts to build anti-missile systems which could defend large territories against nuclear missiles, that ban did not apply in cases where new physical principles offered the promise of missile defense. The treaty stated that in that case, the treaty should be reopened for renegotiation among the parties, the United States and the Soviet Union, in order to take into account these fundamentally new technologies. So that was what the treaty called for, and what Reagan was proposing was, as he said, completely consistent with that treaty. That, too, ruled out what was then known as high frontier. This caused a great deal of consternation and perplexity, and the following day, on March 24th of that year, '83, there were two of the three then existing U.S. TV networks, CBS and NBC, went looking for explanations of what on Earth or what in space Reagan was talking about in the last 5 minutes of that speech. Everyone knew it was something historic, fundamentally new, but what was it? And not surprisingly, those networks first went to their sources in think tanks in Washington, D.C., which were associated with the military-industrial complex. They did this thinking that this would be where Reagan had gone for such ideas. Again, they did not understand Reagan's long background as a Roosevelt Democrat. They didn't understand his extreme sensitivity to the issue of war itself, and also to the deep recession which he had inherited as he came into office. So they assumed he had gone to these kinds of think tanks and to the military-industrial complex, and they asked those think tanks, "What is this?" And they were told point blank by the people they called at those think tanks, "We don't know." And actually, one of the people who responded to one of the CBS phone calls said, we think this is the Fusion Energy Foundation's thing. Why don't you call them? I was at that time executive director of the Fusion Energy Foundation. And so by that strange chain of events, the call came to me, and then subsequently to the research director of the Fusion Energy Foundation, Uva Parpar. The calls came from those two networks, CBS and NBC, to go on television and for the first time explain, and really we remained among civilians, the only people who could explain in any serious way what it was that President Reagan had been talking about. So to get an idea of that, go back all the way to 1977 and to something that I'd like to just quickly read because it started LaRouche on this long campaign which culminated with Reagan's announcement and with the events of 1984, which flowed from it. Back in 1987, in May of 87, the magazine Aviation Week and Space Technology published warnings by General George Keegan, who was the head of Air Force intelligence, that he was making about Soviet experiments on laser and particle beams for defense. He was talking about a closed research facility in Semipalatinsk, Russia. And here's what, it was an editorial in Aviation Week, and here's what it said. Quote, and there's a double quote here because they are quoting at the same time from General Keegan. The Soviet Union has achieved a technical breakthrough in high-energy physics applications that may soon provide it with a directed energy beam weapon capable of neutralizing the entire United States ballistic missile force and checkmating this country's strategic doctrine. The race to perfected directed energy weapons is a reality. Now, part of that, of course, was not true. The Soviets were no more on the verge of achieving such capability than was the United States. As the president truthfully said, this was at least a 1 to 2 decade long scientific and technological revolution that was needed in order to have that military effect. But Lyndon LaRouche was the same person, historic person, who had 3 years before that inaugurated the Fusion Energy Foundation in a series of meetings that he had with scientists who were leaders in the field of plasma physics and in the study of plasma devices or potential plasma devices in general, most definitely including what were called relativistic beams, laser beams, particle beams such as free electron lasers, microwave beams, by relativistic meaning beams which travel at or very near the speed of light, or propagate at or very near the speed of light, and therefore, if they could be developed to this application, they would have a tremendous advantage over the speed of any nuclear missile, and that would include the hypersonic missiles being worked on today by a very, very long margin. These beams would travel and propagate far, far faster, orders of magnitude faster than those missiles, and therefore therein lay their capability as military defensive weapons to destroy them, to make them impotent and obsolete over a long period of time. And the President Reagan stressed, this will be over a long period of sustained effort. Exactly what in the long run did not happen with the American Strategic Defense Initiative program, because of the intense campaign, not only against it, but against Lyndon LaRouche personally, that came from the likes of Henry Kissinger, personally, the circles of Kissinger in the Carter and Reagan, and still in the Reagan administration, from the Soviet Union's early 1983 or early 1980s leadership, Yuri Andropov being at the top of it, made the same attempts to get rid of Lyndon LaRouche, as did the Kissinger faction in and around the Reagan administration. And for that reason, this long 20-year process of scientific revolution that President Reagan clearly was foreseeing was not carried through. But what Lyndon LaRouche did up to the point of that presentation by Reagan, what Lyndon LaRouche had done for a period of 6 years by that time, was to fasten on the point that the only technologies in the future conceivably offering a possibility for this kind of anti-missile defense were the beam technologies, the relativistic beam technologies, which I named. And in LaRouche's mind, that instantly meant that such apparently militarily directed research would actually produce, before it ever produced effective anti-missile screens for a broad area of any country, it would begin to spin off what LaRouche called, in speech after speech after speech following Reagan's announcement, what LaRouche called the laser industrial revolution, which could spread to the developing world as a whole, and particularly if the United States and the Soviet Union worked on it jointly, it could become a powerful means for the development, long postponed, that Franklin Roosevelt had foreseen, sponsored by the capital goods of the advanced economies, but the development and rapid industrialization of the underdeveloped countries of the world. That is what LaRouche saw in what he called, in the early 1980s, a higher peace movement, in order to indicate it was on an entirely different basis than the demonstrators for what they called the nuclear freeze, who were simply saying, stop deploying these missiles. This was a higher peace movement, one which actually pursued what he said, that is, pursuing the end of war through political and economic development means. And that was his policy. You could see it dramatically some years, actually a little more than a little less than a year into the policy, in January 15th of 1984, when, on the occasion of the holiday of Martin Luther King's Day, 10,000 demonstrators came into Washington, organized by LaRouche's movement, in order to call on the Congress for a beam the bomb program, that is specifically a program of the wide-scale development of laser and particle beam and plasma technologies for economic development of the world as a whole, and particularly the developing countries. And among those 10,000 people, I can assure you there were very few arms experts and very few military consultants. They were people led by veterans who had been in the civil rights movement. They were people whose concern and passionate intention was that there might be an opening here for the development of underdeveloped areas of the world, including underdeveloped and now declining industrial areas of the United States, through the propagation of this kind of a laser industrial revolution, as LaRouche called it. So he really had a number of objectives, LaRouche did, in the policy which he started putting forth in mass pamphlets already in 1977. One of those objectives was to bring about the end of the deployment of all these very short-range and intermediate-range missiles all over Europe and the Soviet Union. And by the way, this had been started, this deployment had been started on the British side by the deployment in 1975 and 1976. The British had Polaris submarines. They had the nuclear missiles for those submarines supplied to them by the United States, but they developed their own Cheveline warhead, it was called, which was designed to have the capability to defeat the anti-ballistic missile system immediately around Moscow, which was the only one which the ABM Treaty allowed, one in Russia and one in the United States, which was in the Dakotas. It had these Chevalier warheads were designed to have the ability to defeat that ABM system around Moscow. The British were the first to deploy them in 75 and 76 on the submarines that they operated, the Polaris submarines they operated, and began what then became a tit-for-tat deployment of what were called SS-20 short-range missiles, nuclear missiles, by the Soviet Union, deployment of what were called Pershing II intermediate-range missiles by the United States, by the specifically by the exiting Carter administration on the advice of Henry Kissinger, who had what he called a two-track policy to install Pershing II missiles aimed at the Soviet Union in European countries, thereby making those European countries targets of the SS-20s on the Soviet side. And at the same time, Kissinger said, let's negotiate about maybe eventually removing them. So that policy, that is the way that the nuclear confrontation, which suddenly became so intense in 1981 and 1982, to the point where the fears of nuclear war came back from the 1962 Cuban Missiles Crisis. And again, people were out in the streets demonstrating and were fearful that at any time nuclear war could begin, as is the case right now. That's how that happened. LaRouche had the objective of eliminating those kinds of missiles because those would be the first which would be become the victims of a competent anti-missile defense based on beam weapons. He had the second objective of a laser industrial revolution, as I've discussed, and he had the third objective of beginning to eliminate the so-called MAD policy, mutually assured destruction policy, of which he was campaigning publicly in his presidential campaigns, his mass pamphlet organizing, and so on in the United States from the 1970s on. So the result of what he did was, at that time, to bring into the worsening war situation very suddenly and unexpectedly to anyone who was not working with him, bring in from a higher standpoint, from a higher political and economic development standpoint, the ability to diffuse a crisis. And he went on working with that all during the 1980s, after it became apparent that the Soviet Union's leadership, Andropov et al., were not going to accept Ronald Reagan's offer, which you heard in that speech earlier. So that those three objectives, at least in part, were all obtained. But I think even perhaps more important to see what LaRouche had brought in at that time was that there was a series of large conferences held during 1984 by LaRouche's movement all over the world, in capitals, Berlin, there was one in Paris, there was one in Rome that I spoke at, there was one in Tokyo, there was one, there were also several conferences in South American capitals. In all of these conferences, all were attended by hundreds of people at least. And that was, of course, a time when to attend a conference, you had to attend it. You actually had to go to it. All were attended by hundreds of people at least, and these people were the cream of scientists, of military officers with some experience, of political activists, particularly younger political activists, who were seeking a way out of this war confrontation. These people all had been aware, leading into these conferences and going back into the early 1980s, they all had become aware of the unique campaign which Lyndon LaRouche was waging for the creation of Beam the Bomb, for the creation of anti-missile defenses, eventually to be based on relativistic beam technologies, which immediately would become economically revolutionary and would foster economic development. Those conferences simply showed how widely LaRouche's campaign and his conception of the Strategic Defense Initiative had been understood even before it was announced by President Reagan, and the tremendous reaction of activation of these leading people afterwards. So it was the same strategy which Helga LaRouche and the Schiller Institute are pursuing right now to prevent the current crisis from erupting into a world war as it could literally at any moment while we're talking here.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. And if you've just joined us, today's meeting is called The LaRouche Higher Peace Movement, the Victorious Principle of Westphalia. We actually will probably say a bit more about that. Now, before we go to questions, let me just first of all say that the conference that the Schiller Institute will be doing will be on April 9th. It's up on your screen now. Convoke an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. You see underneath the petition that's being circulated also, which you should please add your name to and begin to organize and help us organize others to sign. And I'd like to, before we go to some of the questions that have come in, Harley, ask you if you have any comments on what you've heard so far from Paul or otherwise.
Well, I think the most important point is the one that Paul made from the beginning, which is that, and what I tried to cover as well, that Lyndon LaRouche had a very different conception of security than people who think of it primarily in military terms. Not that his conception was devoid of military exigencies, but that he understood this from the highest standpoint, that if you have a collapsing economic system or an economic system of an empire which requires the looting of other nations to survive, you're creating the conditions for continuous war. And so he always made the connection between economic policies and security. And I think this is something which should be quite evident today when you look at what's happening in the Western world with the economy, between the hyperinflation, between the loss of energy supplies, the Green New Deal, which is cutting back on nuclear power, on coal, on oil and gas exploration. You know, what you have is an economic policy which goes against the idea of the general welfare of the population. Now, if you do that to your own people, to your own nation, and you insist that no nation has the sovereign right to resist this on their own, then you're creating a world which is heading toward ongoing permanent warfare. And so I think the question that LaRouche posed was that the technologies that are developed are servants of some higher purpose, and that higher purpose is what's represented by the Peace of Westphalia, that every nation should take as its primary consideration and concern the well-being of its neighbors and other nations, not just its allies. You know, it's easy to like your allies. As Yitzhak Rabin said, it's no big deal to make peace with your friends, but making peace with your enemies, that's what the principle of Westphalia addresses. And I think that's what we have to get across today to people in leadership positions in the world, that their policies are destroying the living conditions of most of the people on the planet. And the question then is, can we get the people who are under attack to stop being victimized and feeling sorry for themselves and realize that they have the power, that we are the majority, and that we have to use the instruments of our various nations, the constitutional processes and so on, to make sure that the policies are changed. And that's why our conference is not just about influencing elites, it's about shaping a completely different conception of what the policy must be. And that's where the principle of Westphalia comes in.
Okay, so the first question is this: to what degree are the actions of NATO a response to the February 4th joint statement of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on international relations entering a new era, rather than to the Ukraine conflict as such? So, as actually it's for both of you. So why don't we go to you first, Harley, and then to Paul?
Well, I think that February 4th crystallized the sense that the strategy of pitting Russia against China, which is the old Kissinger strategy. It goes back to the balance of power and the ideas of the Congress of Vienna and so on. But the idea that you could pit Russia against China was obliterated by that February 4th meeting. But the process was underway long before that, both from the standpoint of Russia and China, and the emergence of this economic imperative of a Eurasian perspective, as well as from the West. I mean, it shouldn't have caught the leaders of the West by surprise that Putin and Xi had that summit and signed a whole series of agreements. That had been in the works for quite a while. But I think that that is the driving force of the NATO countries to prevent such an alliance from occurring for two reasons. One is that it represents an alternative for the poor and developing sector countries, the former colonial countries, but also for the European countries. The situation here in Europe right now is not very good. I mean, you have in Germany warnings of blackouts coming. You have top officials saying that Germany as an industrial nation will cease to exist if something is done to break the flow of Russian oil and gas. The shift into the green technologies will in no way guarantee enough energy and electricity to allow these economies to function. So the Europeans are looking to Russia, to China, to India, to Nigeria, to some of the countries that at one point made up the non-aligned nations, who are by and large abstaining from supporting NATO in this instance. So I don't think this is a shock to NATO, but their intention from the beginning was to prevent any kind of alliance which gets in the way of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal.
Okay, Paul? I think you're muted.
Sorry, thanks. Harley covered it. It's obvious that the increasing partnership of China and Russia has been and is the target of the NATO attempt to push Russia, in this case, into war. And I just go back to something Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 2011, which showed how clearly he understood where this policy was going. This was at the time of the bombing of Libya and the overthrow and then assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. At that time, LaRouche said that the target of those regime change wars that were going on and were going to continue to go on was Russia, and that the British Empire in particular, he said, the British financial empire was pursuing a war with Russia. And should it win that war, London would then be able to write off its debts and go about its business. But, said LaRouche, the population of the world would be reduced as a result, greatly reduced, through famine and disease. And what he was foreseeing in the objective of a war with Russia and an economic war to crush Russia is that it would allow the transatlantic countries unhindered, they think, to slam austerity, increased militarization, and deep economic austerity at the same time on their populations and on the populations of all the developing countries as well. That's what they think it allows them to do. It seemed to me it was very obvious in these G7 and NATO meetings, which just took place this week over in Europe, that the European countries were gathering up their gumption. The ministers there were gathering up their audacity to go out and tell their people that now the elimination of fossil fuels and fertilizers and so forth was all going to be done in 3 years, not by 2030, but in the next 3 years. And some of them even thought they were going to do it immediately and let the devil take the populations with the consequences of those policies, including the doubling of the military budgets of the European countries. So seeing what you'd have to call a Shaktian fascist policy input, which was coming into those meetings this week as a result of what they think is an economic and, if necessary, military war in which they will have defeated Russia.
Okay, this question is for you, Paul, and Carly, you may want to comment as well. The question says this, I think it's Kynan. He says, when LaRouche gave a speech concerning the 30th anniversary of the SDI, he said that we were on the verge of a time where we not only have military threats, but also threats from within the solar system itself. At the time, Russia had proposed to the United States the strategic defense of the Earth policy, which was a global system to guard against missiles as well as asteroids and other threats from space. LaRouche had spoken about the urgency to bring an end to the thermonuclear war process. But at the same time, he said there was an urgent mission to perform, which was to put mankind ahead and into the solar system, where a new system of defense would be organized to defend against extraterrestrial threats. Is such a system relevant today to ensure peace and global security?
Well, clearly, yes. It's still the same technological revolution which is involved, as applied through the combination of crash program for thermonuclear fusion development, plasma technologies more broadly, and space colonization, crash programs for both. And there were actually two proposals from the Russian side for strategic defense of Earth in this sense. One that was made at a conference in the United States in Seattle in 1992, and then during the right at the end of the George H.W. Bush administration, as Clinton was coming in. And the second was made much more recently, during the last decade, and specifically called Strategic Defense of Earth. Seamless part of LaRouche's conception of the Strategic Defense Initiative from the beginning. He always said that it was essentially to be achieved as part of a crash space colonization and plasma technology development, fusion development program.
Okay. Harley, have anything to add?
No, that covers it.
Okay, fine. Here's a question that you can take, which was, this person says, I heard that Madeleine Albright died this week, but I don't really know who she was and what she represented. I believe she was an opponent of LaRouche because she once attempted to prevent Henry Kissinger from answering a question that LaRouche was posing to him about China. But what can you tell me about her and what she was?
Well, I'm sure Satan had a welcoming party for her on the way down. Madeleine Albright was a descendant of, I believe, a Czech anti-communist and then a protege of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And in the classic tradition of British geopolitics, while her outward appearance was an anti-communist as she was coming up in the ranks, it was really a geopolitical policy that drove her, that was typically against what we were just talking about, the potential for an alliance between, well, an end to the blocks. You know, if you think about the Brzezinskis and the Kissingers and the Albrights, they came up at a time when the post-World War II period, you had two blocks in the world. You had the Warsaw Pact and you had the NATO. And the question after the end of the Soviet Union was, will we continue to have, why should NATO continue to exist? And Albright and others were clear that a US military and a NATO military power is necessary in the post-Cold War era to enforce the economic and other policies that benefited essentially the City of London and Wall Street. And so that's what Albright represented. Now, in particular, she was committed to the destruction of Yugoslavia. Her father had a background as a very strongly anti-Tito figure. Her personal view, she oversaw the attacks during the Clinton period on Serbia, the bombing. You know, when people say there's never been a war in Europe since World War II, well, there was one. NATO and the US attacked Serbia with incredible firepower in 1999. Now, Albright also presided over the sanctions of the Clinton administration against Iraq, which the United Nations estimated cost 500,000 children their lives from starvation and lack of medical care. And when Albright was asked about this by, I think, Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, was this a price that was worth it? She said, yes, it was worth it. So she had no problem with the killing of 500,000 Iraqis. And so that's the character of this person, Madeleine Albright. And I think the other best characterization I ever heard of her is Lyndon LaRouche's characterization. He said she should be called Madeleine Half-Bright.
All right. Okay. So I assume you don't have anything to add to that, Paul. uh, there's a question for you, which is this. Please comment on the following entry from Wikipedia. Quote, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld reported in his 2011 memoir that at a 2001 dinner in Russia with leading officials, he was told by General Yuri Baluyevsky, then the second highest ranking officer in the Russian military, that LaRouche was the brains behind SDI. Rumsfeld stated that he believed LaRouche had had no influence whatsoever on the program and surmised that Baluyevsky must have obtained the information off the internet. And then the entry then says, in 2012, the former head of the Russian Bureau of Interpol, General Vladimir Ovchinsky, also described LaRouche as the man who proposed the SDI. And the idea here is, while this is on Wikipedia, it doesn't seem to be generally known. So could you comment?
Well, I guess it isn't generally known. That's the condition of the media, but certainly one person who had nothing to do with the development of the SDI was Donald Rumsfeld. So I guess he was speaking sort of from the standpoint of idiocy to idiocy, and thought that whatever had happened in some way off the internet. The Russian officials were extremely aware. I mean, how can anyone doubt this who followed the history during that time, that all during 1984 in particular, the leading Soviet media publications, Pravda, Izvestia, and others, over and over and over attacked Lyndon LaRouche personally as the evil genius, the Rasputin, however they chose to put it, and they chose many ways to put it, behind Reagan's, quote, Star Wars, unquote, program. These Soviet officials and Soviet journalists, so-called, knew who the adversary was that they were talking about, in part because LaRouche had been in back-channel discussions with a Soviet representative at the embassy of the Soviet Union in Washington for a full year before Reagan made his announcement. Not right up to that announcement, because the back channel had been cut off from the Soviet side several months before Reagan made that speech. They were watching it extremely carefully, and they had made the judgment, the Soviet leadership had made the judgment that LaRouche couldn't pull it off, that it simply wasn't going to happen. The Democratic Party was totally against it and would shut it down. There were plenty of people in the Reagan administration who were totally against it. It wasn't going to happen. So that is, the adoption of LaRouche's policy was not going to happen. So they cut off the back channel, which had been going on for a year. And then they found out how wrong they were, but they were intensely following the process by which this policy had been designed and had emerged and had been adopted by Reagan, and then the way it was being pursued. And they continuously, throughout 1984, attacked LaRouche in the leading Soviet publications as its intellectual author, at the same time, sometimes literally on the same day, as he was being attacked by leading Democrats. One such day, I believe, was July 8th, 1984, when he was simultaneously attacked in Chicago at a Democratic press conference by Walter Mondale and by Charles Manat, who was then the chairman of the Democratic Party, who made a big public press conference attack On Reagan, because Reagan's people were meeting with LaRouche's people, this was their press conference, and LaRouche was a evil fascist, as they said. And in the same day, he was being attacked in Pravda as a Nazi and the evil genius behind Reagan's beam weapons policy, Reagan's Star Wars policy, as they called it. So, that history, only somebody who is as fundamentally unserious and incompetent a leader, a defense secretary as Rumsfeld, could say something like that. Everybody knew it. And years later, after the Soviet Union disintegrated, its fall was attributed by Russian experts at a conference in New Jersey in 1991. Its fall was attributed to the Strategic Defense Initiative of Lyndon LaRouche. So they all knew it.
Okay, very good. Harley, any comment about this?
Nope.
Okay, so next question is also for you, Paul. This is, who wrote the speech that Reagan delivered in his remarks announcing the SDI? The section that was shown reflects a language that showed the intention for a higher solution. Did Lyndon LaRouche have any influence at all in the actual speech itself?
He didn't write it. Let me put it that way. He had a profound influence on the last 5 minutes, which is was in there, and then at one point, we found out later, at one point during the day of March 23rd, by the agency of James Baker III, that last 5 minutes was then out of the speech, but then apparently by the agency of Admiral James Watkins, the chief of naval operations, who was a strong advocate of what became the SDI, apparently, at least in part by his agency, it was put back into the speech shortly before Reagan actually gave it. But there were people in the National Security Council who were responsible for the way in which that speech concluded, who were definitely influenced by what LaRouche was doing, yes.
Okay, and this is a question also for you. This comes from YouTube. It's from J.E. I don't know who J.E. is. So any thoughts on this bill in the House for a National Infrastructure Bank, H.R. 3339? Not very many sponsors. Need Glass-Steagall first. So it's a question about a bill. I don't know if you know what it is, but that's the question.
Well, yeah, I know what it is. I think it has only one sponsor right now. It's a very bad parody of an idea for a national infrastructure bank, which was taken directly from me. So for that reason, I'm familiar with it. But it's doesn't have much to recommend it because it's really been distorted and also made into a green a bank to finance green projects of various kinds. In other words, it's been melded into the same orientation as the I forget what they call the Build Back Better program of Biden's, which went off the rails thanks to a couple of Democratic senators a while ago. It was simply became a sidecar to that, which had an interesting idea of how to generate the funds for such projects, but otherwise completely uninteresting. And as the questioner says, you've got to, at the very start, break up the biggest U.S. banks in order for that credit to flow in such a way as to really get high technology infrastructure developed and built. You've got to be able to generate credit not only here, but credit for development in developing countries, for projects together with the Belt and Road Initiative of China and so forth. And that isn't going to work if all of the credit printed by the United States government, that is the Federal Reserve, if all of that is simply going into immense zombie banks, which won't even lend money, despite the fact that they're being loaded with trillions and trillions of deposits by the Federal Reserve. They won't even lend any of it out. Under those circumstances, you've got to break up those banks with the restoration of Glass-Steagall to start with. Then you can talk about whether you have a Hamiltonian national bank for infrastructure and manufacturers or not, which was what my original design was a number of years ago.
Okay, so there's a question for both of you, and this is from Alvin. It says, Larry Fink of the BlackRock gang, overseer of more than ostensibly of more than $10 trillion, laments the shareholders that Russia's military operations in Ukraine are reversing the trend of globalization. As has already been stated, Russia and China grow closer on many levels. What effect can these funds have? Should Russia fear this, or are the real victims in this entire scenario Europe and the transatlantic region? So, you want to go first, Harley?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things on it. I think the important point is that the question of globalization is itself something that has to be refined in terms of the language that's used. I mean, the idea of globalization, of the free market, free trade, neoliberal policy is finished. This is an integral part of the unipolar order. And the idea that a small group of nations, namely essentially the British and the United States with the Europeans under their wings, would impose economic policies to loot the rest of the world. And this has gone on since, especially viciously, since 1971 with the breakup of the Bretton Woods system. Now, this form of globalization was never a lasting, meant for a lasting stabilization. It was always meant to benefit the small, as I mentioned, as a small group of banks and financial institutions. The idea that the unipolar order is the only game in town, which is the theory of the Project for the New American Century, the end of history of Fukuyama and others, was fraudulent. Even Fukuyama now is saying, well, that's not really what he meant. Now, on the other hand, the Chinese talk about globalization, the Russians talk about globalization, meaning what we're talking about, which is that all nations have a vested interest in the development of other nations. And there are many people who react to what we're calling for with I've had people say to me, I can't sign your statement because it's a global policy. Well, the fact is that there is an integrated world economy. And if you don't believe that, try and buy vegetable oil now in Germany. Probably it's going to be a problem in the United States soon because most of the sunflowers and other products that go into vegetable oil come from Russia and Ukraine. So we do have a global economy. The question is, under the globalization of the Davos crowd and the World Economic Forum, it's for the benefit of the few. What we have to do is create a system where each nation is able to benefit from relations with other nations. And that's the solution to this question. So I think what Fink is lamenting is that the idea that, as Paul was just discussing, that the small group of bankers are able to control the narrative and the discussion and the flow of credit, And now they want, with the Great Reset, to control the spending of governments. That is, they want every government under the thumb of the central banks and the private bankers that run the central banks. That's gone. The question is, do you have the world break up into an autarky of each against all? Or can we organize a system that will work for the benefit of each nation? And so I think that's what I'd want to say about that.
Okay, fine. Paul?
Well, the fact that BlackRock Inc. has just admittedly lost $17 billion in Russia might have to do with Fink making dramatic statements like that. But, what Harley said is true, that what the NATO nations are doing in their drive to crush permanently the Russian economy is tending to bring down the financial system of the transatlantic countries and the transatlantic banks. That's too big a subject to get into right now, but I think people can see many of the effects, and especially in all kinds of investments in commodities production, commodities distribution, commodities trading, commodities storage. You have literally thousands of companies around the world that have seen margin calls which they could not meet since March 4th, in particular, when these monster sanctions really hit, and not only margin calls, but they've also experienced large losses. And Fink's BlackRock is one of those.
Yeah, okay, I just got something. I just want to refer to you each, and then after that, I guess we'll take a few summary remarks. This is something we have from RT, so note that it is new and it's just come in, so it has to be evaluated. But the headline is Putin, quote, cannot remain in power, Biden. U.S. President demands regime change for Russia. And here's what it says. U.S. President Joe Biden has called for Russian President Vladimir Putin to be deposed. He made a direct appeal to the Russian people during a speech in Warsaw, where he had met for talks with high-ranking Ukrainian officials on Saturday. And then they have the following from him, quote, for God's sake, comma, this man cannot remain in power, Biden declared at the end of an emotionally overwrought speech in the Polish capital's royal castle. While he has previously denounced Putin as, quote, a war criminal and a dictator, and lobbed at him all manner of other geopolitical insults, this was his first recorded demand that the president be removed from office. Goes on and says some other things. Biden spoke more sternly to Russian leaders, wanting them not to, quote, even think about moving on one single inch of NATO territory due to the, quote, sacred obligation the alliance has under Article 5, so forth and so on. And has some other things. A White House official hastily followed up Biden's speech by unpacking the statements that pointed toward regime change for Russia, insisting, quote, the president's point was that Putin cannot be allowed to exercise power over his neighbors or the region. He was not discussing Putin's power in Russia or regime change. So obviously, this is one of these rolling circumstances. I wonder if you have any comments on that. And in any case, we're going to start to move toward our conclusion remarks. Before you say anything, could we have again at this moment our Schiller Institute conference advertisement? This is a good time to advertise. If you can put it up, Jose. The conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. It's April 9th. That's going to be 2 Saturdays from now. It's going to be starting at 9 a.m. in the morning. You can register below. right there. Go on and click. They're moving the cursor back and forth so I can't miss it. To say, click on there to register for our conference and also organize others. It's all going to be done as a virtual conference. Unlike, as Paul said, the days when you had to actually attend something to attend it, you just have to basically register and be present intellectually, if not bodily. That is in the same location. So I just wanted to say that. So let's go back and ask. Let's go to you first, Paul, if you have any particular response to what you heard and anything else you'd like to say in summary.
Oh, well, on what you just reported, it seems like something raising the stakes and raising the possibility of an accidental acceleration into direct war with Russia. Something like this seems to happen just about every day. And I'm sure that coming from Biden, it requires more evaluation and maybe even just being walked back. I don't know. Many of his statements, I mean, he is something of an old Irish tough who tends to run at the mouth and get emotional in situations like this when he's talking about this or other situations. So it does have to be evaluated. But on the more important thing that we're discussing today, we have to be aware of such possible triggers going on all the time, because one of these may lead to an actual escalation of statements, an escalation of deployments, or in fact could lead to an escalation to world war without our even knowing that it was going on, that such an escalation was going on. There have been times in the post-war period between the United States and the Soviet Union when such escalation went up very rapidly towards nuclear war without the vast majority of humanity even knowing anything was occurring in the way that it did know back in the 1962 Cuban Missiles Crisis. So we have to be aware of that, and that what we are doing really is in a kind of desperate intensity, deploying what LaRouche said back in that 1984 document that we heard him reading from back at the top of this program, that war is avoided by political and economic means, by political and economic development means, and that when war is underway, when it has broken out and is in danger of escalating, it must be ended by political and economic agreements, which have the benefit of all nations, or at least all nations involved, and hopefully the benefit of all nations in the world as their objective. And that is exactly what the Schiller Institute's April 9th conference and the process of organizing it, that's what it is about. So in that sense, the Schiller Institute, with its led by its founder, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, is pursuing exactly the same approach, the same concept to avoiding the worst for civilization now that Lyndon LaRouche did in that period from 1977, 76, 77 up till the middle 1980s.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Harley?
Well, I think if in fact Biden said that, as reported by RT, calling for Putin to be deposed and appealing to the Russian people, my first thoughts are that it reflects two processes which are underway. First of all, that regime change has been the intent from the beginning, not from the beginning of the Russian operations in Ukraine, but from the post-Cold War period, to control Russia as a small nation without industrial development, without a strong economy, as a third world profile, as a raw material exporter. That's been the intention of the Wall Street, City of London crowd going back to the end of the Soviet Union. And Biden, as Paul said, being the kind of guy he is, just speaks from the hip from time to time. Maybe he's just reflecting the discussion that's going on around him from his so-called Tiger team, which is there to try to rally support for a tougher line against Russia. So on the one side, you have this as a regime change, a reflection of the regime change as the intent. But I think it also shows a second point, the delusion that exists in these arrogant fools who see themselves as the controllers of a world unipolar order. You know, the idea that, first of all, that the Russian people would listen to Biden. Very few Americans listen to Biden. And the idea that Biden could get up on the bully pulpit in Warsaw and say, you have to overthrow your leader, you have to rise up, you know, is a delusion of the idea that the Russian people are unhappy and are just waiting for the spark to get rid of the government. The fact is that the U.S. policy and the NATO policy is increasing Putin's support in Russia, because Russia has seen this before. They saw it in the Napoleonic War. They saw it from Hitler. And the idea that somehow Joe Biden speaks for the world when he says, for God's sakes, Putin has to go, it just shows the extent to which this delusion of the unipolar power controls the thinking of at least the puppets who are there to carry it out. I think this brings up one final point, the idea that the world wants American-style democracy, when in fact the illusion of democracy in the United States has been exposed in recent years with the censorship, with the torture policy, with whether it's Gitmo or whether post-January 6th, keeping people in prison without an ability to get to court and have a fair trial. Also, you look at Ukraine, the banning of opposition parties, the shutting down of opposition media. That's the democracy we're supposed to fight for. So this attempt to divide the world between the democratic countries and the autocrats is another fraud and a delusion. These things have to be cleared away. And it's a problem because the media control keeps people from seeing what's actually behind this. And that's why it's so important that what Lyndon LaRouche always emphasized, the interconnection between physical economic development as a principle governing actual human behavior versus the slavery inherent in the neoliberalism, the geopolitical concepts, and so on. That's what we have to make clear to people, that the human race is defined by the unique character of its creative potential. And that's what's under attack, ultimately, to turn us into beasts who will be satisfied to fight with our neighbor over a shrinking pie. Instead, this idea of the conference is to make visible to people what generally is invisible, which is the economic principles which allow nations to thrive and to live together in peace.
A little flurry at the end there, Harley, just concerning the conference and what people can do around it. And I just wanted to have you do something, which is to say a little bit about what's been happening in our interchanges, both via social media and in the organizing process in general, because I think there's been a sort of a sea change in the United States, which we've noticed both in the streets and also in our work on the phones. That is, there's no longer a kind of a left-right gap. Maybe that's because Trotskyism has gone wild among the Democratic neocons. I don't know, but it seems to have broken down everything. So whether the people were pro-Trump or Bernie Sanders, whoever they may have supported in the last electoral cycle, we're talking to Americans from all walks of life now. And if you could say a bit about your own experience in that and some things people might do to organize for this conference, it would be appreciated.
Well, I think what's clear is that very few people trust authorities, and for good reason, because we've seen authorities make pronouncements which are visibly false and destructive. And so the effort of the initial intent of social media, which was to essentially create space between people, the idea that you can retreat into your own reality as a libertarian idea. I think what's happening is that people are recognizing that the direction of society is intolerable. And the problem is that they tend to abide by this artificial division of left and right, liberal, conservative. If someone talks about general welfare, they must be a communist. You have these kinds of axioms that are out there, but are challenged now. One example of this is Tulsi Gabbard suddenly becoming a hero for Tucker Carlson. Carlson, a conservative libertarian type. Gabbard is anything but that. But what she does reflect is a fight for truth. And the idea that the policy toward Ukraine, the policy toward Afghanistan, that this is intolerable for a person who supports the American Constitution. So what we're finding is that people who initially were responding out of anger, frustration, and fear are open, if you can catch them, to the kinds of discussion that we've been having this evening or this afternoon. People are open to that. We're seeing it, just the volume of views of the videos that we do with the LaRouche organization. My daily update, which was languishing for a while at 400 to 500 views on YouTube. Now it's 2,500 or more on YouTube. And of course, that's probably a gross undercounting by the way YouTube does things. But 30, 40, 50, even 130,000, 30,000, 40,000, up to 130,000 views on Facebook. People sharing, people writing to me. I received almost 800 emails after an interview I did with the X-22 report. And there are many, many of the alternative media that should be bringing our spokesman on to discuss what we've been discussing here today. So one of the things people can do is wherever you turn for your news, and I'm sure it's not CNN or MSNBC or the New York Times, but wherever you turn for discussion or for ideas, contact the people there and ask them to bring a representative of the Schiller Institute on, or on your local radio where there's talk shows. Bring up this conference, the April 9th conference, and why people should be a part of that. What most people don't realize is that there are many, many more people out there who feel the alienation that you feel from the existing establishment, but they don't know how to direct it. That's why a single voice can be magnified in a period like this. So look for every opportunity at work, at church, in the community, to bring up these ideas and recognize that you're not alone. Most of the world's population is not behind the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. That's why they're threatening war as a way of imposing it. They have no other way of doing it. And we have the upper hand. They're the ones who are bankrupt. They're the ones who are living on fiat money and funny money and so on. And we have a plan to rebuild the world economy and the economy of every single nation. So if you're with us, go out and organize and have fun doing it, and poke a lot of fun at people who believe that someone like Madeleine Albright actually knew what she was talking about.
All right, so Paul Gallagher, Harley Schlanger, thank you very much for being with us today, and thank all everybody that has listened to the conference today. We certainly urge that you would get this around. I want to say a couple of things, therefore, in conclusion. So our conference will be in 2 weeks. We're asking that everybody help to organize it, but we're trying to do some very specific things. First, we want to force into public discussion through social media, printed media, and every other means, the admission of the fact that's still suppressed for 39 years, that it was through the ideas and efforts of Lyndon LaRouche that the United States presidency back in 1983 proposed a policy to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, and they would have dealt with any of the weapons that we're right now being threatened by, or think we're being threatened by, or threatening other people with. We have to provoke military and intelligence people, government institutions, and the citizenry at large in every nation to do something that might be even more frightening to them than nuclear war, which is to give up the axioms around geopolitics and the axioms around monetary theory. That is, that we have to think about the idea of the general welfare of humanity rather than my money, or think about the idea of not trying to grab a piece of land and that's supposedly a political act. The only way to really do that, though, to get people to change that view, is to cause people to recognize that our true strategic problem does not lie in weapons. It doesn't even lie in crazy people who are occupying positions of power and authority over us. It lies in the rejection of the notion that there's only one human race, or one human species, and that the interest of the species as a whole is the interest of all parts of the species. When we talk about this idea of the Treaty of Westphalia's benefit of the other, it was that Tony Blair attacked in 1999 when he called for what he called the responsibility to protect, which was the change in the policy from the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. And that's what's been disastrous for humanity as a whole. But the conception of a single humanity, which is now widely rejected, is essential for the continued existence, growth, development, and prosperity of our entire species. And that's what we have to get across. What we're going to do today is to conclude with a short excerpt from a speech that Lyndon LaRouche gave in 1995 to a Schiller Institute conference as a way of giving you, if you will, the inside view of how that conception of humanity thought about in terms of how education itself goes on and how you get to this idea should inform our work over the next couple of weeks as we seek to pull together, just like Lyndon LaRouche did, as a private citizen, a change in policy direction that might seem to be unavailable to us, but a change in policy direction, including the presidency of the United States, that we in the transatlantic world, we in the United States, and we who are gathered here today can implement. So we're going to play this now, and we again ask that you join us in our work to organize this conference, and we'll see you again next week.
You all remember that you were exposed to a school, and most of you had an education which, you think about it, you'll object to. Most of you were given a textbook or something equivalent. You were told you were supposed to learn to repeat after me, so to speak, what authorities of the past had discovered. And today you were prepared to pass a multiple choice questionnaire, aren't you? Now, if you went to a good school, that wouldn't happen to you. In a good school, such as the one that Nicholas of Cusa attended as an adolescent, you would be given a text written hundreds or thousands of years ago, such as Aristophanes, concretely, Plato, and so forth. You would be given a text. You would read the text and you say, well, what does this text mean? And the text would be a report on a fundamental discovery of principle by some gentleman. Gentlemen seem to do most of the reported discovering in those days, hundreds or thousands of years before. And you as a student would relive the mental act of discovery which that original discoverer went through. What you would be doing with this kind, which is called a classical humanist method of education, unlike what's done in schools today, you would be reliving the act of discovery of the greatest known minds in all history. Now, if you do that for about 4 or 5 or 6 years as a good pre-secondary and secondary school education, after about 6 years of replicating some of the most crucial discoveries of principle made by the known greatest minds in all history, your mental powers are pretty well developed, aren't they? Now, even if you have a bad education, the way you learn something is not by learning to repeat after me. You learn by working it through. And when you work through ideas and discoveries, to repeat them, to say, can I believe this? Is it true? You get a sense of truth. And you also get a sense of the same thing that a classical humanist education provides you. Thus, what is happening through education and similar expressions in society, I'll get to one other case as a good example of this. The young child has transmitted to it a replication of the great discovery, not ideas as something words you paste on a wall, but the act of discovering an idea, which is a real idea. The child relives some of the crucial discoveries of all mankind today. One of the most important discoveries that men and women relive as children is the discovery of language. Language is one of the great inventions of mankind. It's a great development. It has a history. We know from the great scholar Panini, the philologist who lived about the 5th century BC in India, who wrote of the Sanskrit language, and we know something about the dating of the Vedic origin of the Sanskrit language. We know that the Sanskrit language, perhaps 5,000 years ago, or in the Vedic form, between about 4,000 BC, is when we can date the Vedic to before 4,000 BC in Central Asia by astronomical content. That this language is a highly developed language. As a language structure, was one of those highly developed that ever existed on this planet. Already then. So even in the early days of pre-science, mankind had already made a number of inventions, of which language is the most important of this time, which the child today is actually reliving tens of thousands of years of development of human knowledge, of fundamental discoveries, in just learning a language. So yes, I have to give a child a little chance to learn language. Phil Graham, of course, you have to give it a lot longer, but that's different. Now, let's take the case of music. How do you learn music? By learning how to read a score? No, you don't. You learn to perform music by reliving the experience and learning from composers. You actually relive the same thing. So what mankind does is mankind relives history of thousands of generations before, with emphasis on some of the most crucial contributions that are known to be contributions. That is it. What happens? Thus, in this way, mankind, I can tell you that I know Plato personally better than know most of the people I've shaken hands with. And he was dead over 2,000 years before I was born. Why? Because I know the inside of his mind. Because I have relived some of the most important moments in his mind. I have recreated, in a sense, in my own mind, some of the greatest moments of thought experience he had. Aristophanes, the discovery of Aristophanes, which any child can relearn. Same thing, we can demonstrate to children this discovery. We should. Good schools would do that. Therefore, what happens? We are now linked together. We cannot be separated by the grave. We are linked together across thousands of years into the past and thousands of years into the future. The entire human species is linked together. Through what? Through the commonality of those aspects of ourselves which are our true selves, which belong to this quality of creative intellect, which defines each of us in the living image of God.